The August sun blazed down on the Montana wilderness like the devil's own furnace. Heat waves shimmered off the rocky ground, creating mirages that danced and vanished like ghosts. Before we dive deeper into this twisted story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and enjoy. Jeremiah, Big Jake, McCready, a massive man of 45 with shoulders broad as a barn door, rode slowly through the pine forest on his enormous black stallion, Thunder. His weathered leather coat hung open, revealing arms thick as tree trunks and a chest that could stop a charging buffalo. Jake had spent the last 15 years tracking creatures that most folks claimed didn't exist. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, the wild man of the woods. Whatever name you gave it, Jake McCready was the only hunter in 3 territories who'd actually seen one with his own eyes. That was back in '71, when he'd lost his wife Sarah to a fever that no doctor could cure. In his grief, he'd fled to the mountains, and there, in a moonlit clearing, he'd encountered the massive, hairy beast that changed his life forever. The creature hadn't attacked. Instead, it had looked at Jake with eyes that held an ancient sadness, as if it understood loss better than any human ever could. From that moment on, Jake dedicated his life to proving these beings existed, not to harm them, but to protect them from those who would. His horse suddenly snorted and shied away from something up ahead. Jake's keen eyes, pale blue like winter ice, scanned the forest floor. There, partially hidden beneath a fallen log, was a small bundle of torn fabric. As Thunder stepped closer, Jake's heart nearly stopped. It was a child, a little native girl, maybe 8 years old, unconscious and barely breathing. Her lips were cracked from thirst, her small body curled in exhaustion. In her tiny fist, she clutched an empty water pouch made from animal hide. Jake dismounted in one fluid motion despite his size. His massive hands, gentle as a mother's touch, checked for her pulse. It was there, weak but steady. He looked around the forest. No tracks, no sign of anyone else. Just the hot wind whistling through the pines. Without hesitation, Jake pulled his own water skin from his belt and carefully dripped the precious liquid onto the child's lips. She swallowed reflexively, her small hand gripping his thick finger. That tiny gesture of life was enough. "Come on, little one," Jake whispered, his deep voice rumbling like distant thunder. "Let's get you somewhere safe." He lifted her easily, her frail body light as a feather in his powerful arms, and mounted Thunder. The child's fever burned against his chest as he turned toward his cabin, hidden deep in the Montana wilderness. Jake's cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by towering pines and ancient oaks. He'd built it with his own hands after Sarah's death, massive logs that could withstand anything the wilderness threw at them. A stone chimney rose from the center, and a covered porch wrapped around the front. It was a lonely place, but it was home. Inside, Jake laid the girl on his own bed near the stone fireplace. He built a small fire and warmed water from his emergency store. Gently, he cleaned the dust and grime from her face, revealing high cheekbones and sun-darkened skin. Her breathing was shallow but growing stronger. Jake pulled up his old wooden chair and sat vigil. It had been 20 years since another human voice had filled this cabin. Sarah had died here, in this very bed, while Jake held her hand and watched helplessly as fever took her away. Since then, he'd chosen solitude, venturing into town only when absolutely necessary for supplies. Folks in Timber Falls knew him as the crazy mountain man who claimed to hunt monsters. They whispered stories about Big Jake McCready, how he could track anything through any terrain, how he'd once fought off a grizzly bear with his bare hands, how he talked to the trees and claimed the forest spirits spoke back. They thought he'd lost his mind to grief, and maybe they weren't entirely wrong. But now, watching this child's chest rise and fall, Jake felt something crack inside him. The silence that had been his companion for 2 decades suddenly felt oppressive. He reached out and brushed a strand of dark hair from her forehead. "You just keep breathing, little warrior," he murmured. "Old Jake's got you now." That night, he didn't sleep. He sat by the fire, listening to the wood crackle and pop, watching the flames dance shadows across the log walls. Outside, wolves howled in the distance, and something large crashed through the underbrush. Might have been an elk, might have been something else entirely. But inside the cabin, the fire kept the child warm, and Jake understood something profound. The moment he'd given her his water, his life was no longer just his own. On the third morning, golden sunlight streamed through the windows as Jake stepped onto his porch with a cup of bitter coffee. The child was sleeping more peacefully now, her breathing steady and strong. The fever had broken during the night. Thunder suddenly whinnied and pawed the ground, ears pricked forward. Jake's hunter instincts kicked in immediately. His pale eyes scanned the tree line, and there, emerging from the morning shadows, came three figures walking with purpose and power. They were women, but unlike any Jake had ever seen. Each one stood well over 6 feet tall, with frames that spoke of incredible strength. The one in the lead was the largest, easily 6'6", with shoulders that could carry the world. Her long black hair was braided with feathers and beads, and she wore a dress made of deer hide that emphasized rather than hid her powerful build. Her arms were thick as most men's legs, and her hands looked like they could crush stone. Behind her walked 2 others, equally imposing. One appeared younger, with muscles that rippled beneath her buckskin shirt as she moved. The third was older, her face weathered by sun and wind, but her bearing was that of a warrior queen. They stopped 20 paces from the porch, and the silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Jake's hand instinctively moved toward the massive hunting knife on his belt, not to draw it, but from pure habit developed over years in the wilderness. The lead woman stepped forward. When she spoke, her voice was deep and resonant, cutting through the mountain air without effort. "You hold our sister." Jake didn't move. His heart beat steady and strong in his chest. He glanced back toward the cabin where the little girl slept, then faced the 3 women again. Their eyes were locked on him, watchful, fierce, and sharp as obsidian blades. For a moment, Jake considered simply placing the child outside and walking away. But something deep in his chest had already made its decision. He cleared his throat, his voice rough from disuse. "She was dying when I found her. My water brought her back. If she's your blood, come and take her." The massive woman nodded slowly. In the morning light, Jake could see past her weathered exterior to something else: pain, hope, and what might have been gratitude. The 3 women stepped onto his porch, their weight making the sturdy boards groan. The quiet cabin, so long accustomed to solitude, seemed to tremble with their presence. When they entered, the ceiling felt suddenly low, and the firelight flickered across their scarred, sun-darkened faces. The little girl woke at the sound of their voices and sprang from the bed, running straight into the arms of the largest woman. Their embrace was so fierce that Jake could hear their hearts beating. No one spoke, but their reunion filled the cabin with more emotion than Jake had felt in 20 years. He quietly poured water into a metal basin and placed it on the table, along with what little food he had: jerky, hardtack, and coffee. The eldest woman knelt with surprising grace for someone her size, broke a piece of bread, and fed it to the child. Then she looked at Jake with steady, dark eyes. No words of thanks were spoken, and none were needed. In that single nod, Jake understood they knew he'd saved the girl's life. Over the following days, the cabin transformed into something Jake had never imagined. The 3 women, he learned their names were Ayana, the eldest, Kiona, the younger one, and Winona, the weathered elder, brought an energy that made the old logs seem to expand and breathe. They shared everything: water, food, even the meager supplies Jake had stored for winter. Kiona, despite her size, moved with surprising agility, hauling massive logs to build additional sleeping quarters. Winona, her hands gnarled but steady, worked tirelessly to expand Jake's small garden plot. But it was Ayana who captured Jake's attention. She stood nearly as tall as he did, her frame built for endurance and strength. When she worked alongside him to repair the cabin's roof, her massive hands were surprisingly gentle, her movements precise and efficient. Jake, who had worked alone for 20 years, found himself part of something larger. He showed them how to track game through the dense forest, and they taught him their people's secrets: how to read the wind for weather changes, how to find water in the driest season, how to move through the woods without disturbing so much as a twig. At night, they sat around the expanded fireplace, the little girl, whose name was Ayana's daughter, Chenoa, giggling as Kiona made shadow puppets on the wall. Jake watched them, these powerful women who had survived losses he could barely imagine, yet remained unbroken. One evening, as Jake was banking the fire for the night, Ayana appeared beside him. Together, they added the final logs, her large hands brushing against his calloused fingers. The touch sent an unexpected warmth through his chest. "You have given us more than water," she said quietly, her deep voice barely above a whisper. "You have given us hope." Jake looked at her in the firelight. Her face showed every hardship, every scar earned through survival, but there was something else, a tenderness that needed no words. "I gave what I had to give," Jake replied. "Same as you would have done." They stood close in the dancing shadows, two souls who understood loss, who had learned to carry grief without letting it break them. When Ayana's hand covered his on the mantel, Jake didn't pull away. For the first time in 20 years, the cabin felt truly alive. But their peace was shattered one scorching afternoon when thunder reared and whinnied in terror. A dust cloud was approaching fast. Riders, at least a dozen of them, led by a man Jake recognized with a sick feeling in his gut. Ezekiel Zeke Hartwell, the territorial marshal, sat high on a white stallion, his badge gleaming in the sun. Behind him rode his notorious posse, hardened men known for their brutal methods. Hartwell was a thin, cruel man with a reputation for cleaning up native populations by any means necessary. The riders surrounded the cabin, kicking up clouds of dust. Hartwell's cold gray eyes surveyed the scene with obvious displeasure. "McCready," he called out, his voice sharp as breaking glass. "I hear you've been harboring fugitives. These Apache women escaped from the reservation 3 weeks ago. They're wanted for questioning in connection with several missing persons." Jake stepped onto the porch, his massive frame filling the doorway. He made no move toward his weapons, but his presence alone was intimidating. "I've got guests here, Marshal. Folks who needed water and shelter. That's all." Hartwell's thin lips twisted into a sneer. "These aren't people, McCready. They're property of the U.S. government, assigned to the reservation for everyone's safety. I have legal authority to take them back." From inside the cabin, Ayana emerged, her towering figure casting a long shadow. Kiona and Winona flanked her, creating an imposing wall of strength and defiance. Little Cheno appeared out from behind her mother's protective bulk. "Look at the size of them," one of Hartwell's men whispered nervously. "They're like giants." Hartwell's eyes narrowed. "Size doesn't matter when you've got the law on your side. And bullets." Jake's voice rumbled like an approaching storm. "No one's taking anyone from this cabin, Marshal. These women and the child are under my protection." "Your protection?" Hartwell laughed harshly. "You're just a crazy old mountain man who chases monsters. You have no authority here." The marshal raised his hand, and his men began to dismount, hands moving toward their weapons. The air grew thick with tension, ready to explode under the blazing sun. Jake stepped down from the porch, his massive hunting knife now visible at his belt, though he made no move to draw it. "You're right about one thing, Marshal. I do hunt monsters. And right now, I'm looking at the biggest one I've ever seen." Behind him, the three women stepped forward, their combined presence so imposing that several of Hartwell's men actually stepped back. These weren't helpless reservation natives. These were warriors, and their protective fury was almost palpable. Suddenly, from the deep forest came a sound that made everyone freeze, a deep, resonant howl that seemed to shake the very trees. It was followed by another, then another, echoing from multiple directions. "What in hell?" one of the men began, but his words were cut short as something massive crashed through the underbrush at the forest's edge. A figure emerged that made even Jake's eyes widen in amazement. It stood nearly 9 feet tall, covered in thick, dark fur, with shoulders that dwarfed even Ayana's impressive frame. Its face was almost human but primitively powerful, with intelligent eyes that blazed with protective fury. A Sasquatch. A real, living Bigfoot. But Jake's amazement turned to understanding as more shapes appeared, an entire family of the creatures, moving with surprising silence for beings of their size. The lead male fixed its ancient gaze directly on Marshal Hartwell, and when it spoke, its voice was like the rumble of an avalanche. "These women, under Tathartsu protection too." Hartwell's face went white. His men's hands shook as they stared at creatures that weren't supposed to exist. Several of them dropped their reins, backing their horses away from the cabin. The lead Sasquatch stepped forward, and Jake noticed something that made his heart race. Around its neck was a crude necklace made from Sarah's wedding ring, the one he'd lost in these very woods 20 years ago. The creature had been watching him, protecting him all these years. The hunted the child, the massive being continued, its words slow but clear. We remember kindness. We protect kindness. More Sasquatch emerged from the forest. Males, females, even young ones. They formed a semicircle around Hartwell's men, their presence so overwhelming that the horses began to panic, rearing and whinnying in terror. One of Hartwell's men threw down his gun and fled on foot into the woods. Others followed, their courage evaporating in the face of legends come to life. "This isn't over, McCready," Hartwell screamed as he fought to control his terrified horse. "I'll be back with the army if I have to." But his threats rang hollow as he wheeled his mount and galloped away, his remaining men close behind. The dust of their retreat hung in the air like a dirty curtain. Jake stood in wonder as the lead Sasquatch approached. Up close, he could see the intelligence in its eyes, the same ancient sadness he'd recognized 20 years ago. "Remember me?" Jake said, not really a question. The creature nodded slowly. "You're broken. Watch. Healed slowly. Now, help the others heal." Ayana stepped up beside Jake, showing no fear of the massive creature. "Your forest people saved us all today," she said simply. The Sasquatch looked at her with something resembling approval. "Parchwim so strong. Good mothers. Good warriors." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, an extraordinary scene unfolded around Jake's cabin. The Sasquatch family settled peacefully at the forest's edge while the three women and little Chenoa worked to prepare an evening meal. Jake sat on his porch steps, watching it all with amazement. Ayana settled beside him, her weight making the step creak, but her presence bringing him a peace he'd never known. "In my people's legends," she said quietly, "the forest guardians only reveal themselves to those pure of heart. They chose to protect us because they saw your spirit, Jake McCready." Jake looked at her, this magnificent woman who had transformed his solitary existence into something rich and full of purpose. Maybe they saw something I didn't know was still there. That night, for the first time since Sarah's death, Jake didn't feel alone. The cabin was filled with soft conversation in multiple languages, English, Apache, and the deep, rumbling tones of the Sasquatch family outside. Little Chenoa had fallen asleep curled against Jake's side, and he found himself gently stroking her hair the way he once had with Sarah. As the fire burned low, Ayana moved closer to Jake on the wide hearth. Her large hand found his, fingers intertwining. "The hunter has found something better than his prey," she whispered. Jake squeezed her hand, marveling at how perfectly it fit with his. "Maybe I was hunting for the wrong thing all along." Outside, the Sasquatch family began a low, harmonic chant that seemed to blend with the night wind. It was a song of protection, of welcome, of family bonds that transcended species. The months that followed transformed not just Jake's cabin but his entire understanding of what family could mean. Ayana, Kiona, and Winona had no intention of leaving, and Jake discovered he had no desire for them to go. Together, they expanded the cabin into a proper homestead, with separate quarters for privacy but common areas where they gathered for meals and evening conversations. The Sasquatch family, led by the patriarch Jake had come to call Old Sage, became regular visitors. They shared knowledge of the deep forest, taught Jake and the women which plants could heal and which could harm, and in return, the humans shared their food and their fire on cold nights. Little Chenoa thrived in this unusual environment. She learned to track from Jake, traditional crafts from her mother and aunts, and forest lore from the Sasquatch young ones. She called Jake Mountain Papa, and seemed to bridge all the different worlds that had come together in this remote clearing. But it was Jake and Ayana's growing relationship that truly transformed the mountain homestead. Despite their size difference, or perhaps because of it, they complemented each other perfectly. Her strength matched his, Her knowledge of survival skills enhanced his own, and her fierce protective nature aligned completely with his own instincts. One evening in late autumn, as they sat watching the sun set behind snow-capped peaks, Ayana turned to Jake with a serious expression. "My husband died fighting the cavalry 5 years ago," she said quietly. "I thought I would never trust my heart to another man, especially not a white man." Jake nodded, understanding the courage it took for her to share that pain. "Sarah was everything to me. When she died, I figured that was it for love in my life." They sat in comfortable silence, watching their breath mist in the cooling air. Then Ayana spoke again, her deep voice soft with emotion. "But hearts are stronger than we think. They can heal, and they can love again, if we're brave enough to let them." Jake turned to face her fully, taking in her magnificent presence, the way firelight played across her high cheekbones, the strength evident in every line of her body, the gentleness in her dark eyes that most people never got to see. "Ayana," he began, then stopped, searching for words adequate to express what he felt. She smiled, a rare, radiant expression that transformed her entire face. "You don't need to say it, Jake McCready. I feel it too." Their first kiss was as powerful and gentle as everything else about their relationship. When they finally parted, Jake rested his forehead against hers, marveling at how perfectly they fit together despite their different backgrounds. The winter that followed was harsh even by mountain standards, but the expanded homestead weathered it well. The Sasquatch family retreated to deeper caves but maintained contact, sometimes leaving gifts of rare medicinal plants or perfectly crafted tools at the cabin's edge. Jake taught Chenoa to ice fish and helped Kiona and Winona prepare for the spring planting. But his greatest joy was the quiet evenings spent with Ayana, planning their future together, talking about their losses and dreams, learning each other's languages both spoken and unspoken. When Marshal Hartwell returned in spring with a cavalry detachment, he found a very different situation than he'd expected. The fugitive Apache women were now legally married. Kiona to a trapper from town who'd been courting her for months, Winona to a widowed store owner who was delighted to have found such a capable partner, and Ayana to Jake himself in a ceremony conducted by the circuit preacher. More importantly, the territorial governor had received a detailed report about Sasquatch families in the region, written jointly by Jake and a visiting naturalist from back east. The creatures were now under federal protection as a unique species, and the forest around Jake's homestead had been designated as a wildlife preserve. Hartwell could do nothing but tip his hat grudgingly and ride away, his authority superseded by higher powers and his prejudices defeated by legal facts. As summer bloomed across the mountain meadows, Jake stood on his expanded porch watching his extraordinary family. Chenoa and the young Sasquatch were playing an elaborate game of hide-and-seek among the trees. Kiona and Winona, now living in town but frequent visitors, were teaching Ayana to read from one of Jake's precious books. Old Sage approached through the garden, moving with the silent grace of his kind despite his massive size. He'd become not just Jake's ally but his friend, often joining him for quiet conversations in the evening. "Really hunting," the great creature observed, settling onto a specially reinforced bench Jake had built for such visits. Jake nodded, one arm around Ayana's shoulders as she leaned against him. "Turns out I wasn't hunting Bigfoot at all. I was hunting for belonging. All creatures need family. Family." As the sun set behind the peaks, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Jake reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He'd started as a broken man chasing legends in the wilderness, trying to fill the hole left by grief and loss. Instead, he'd found something infinitely more valuable, a love that honored his past while building toward the future, a family that spans species and traditions, and a purpose that went beyond his own pain. The little Apache girl he'd saved with his last drops of water had become his daughter in every way that mattered. The three powerful women who'd seemed so intimidating had become the foundation of a new kind of community. The legendary creatures he'd sought to prove existed had become his protectors and guides. And Ayana, magnificent Ayana, had become his partner, his equal, his heart's home. That night, As they sat around their fire with the sounds of multiple languages creating a symphony of belonging, Jake understood that sometimes the greatest hunt of all is the one for connection, for people who see your heart clearly and choose to share the journey anyway. The Bigfoot hunter had found his prey after all. But it wasn't a creature he could capture or display. It was love, family, and home, the most elusive treasures in any wilderness, and the only ones worth spending a lifetime seeking. As Old Sage began his nightly chant of protection and gratitude, joined by Ayana's strong alto voice and little Chenoa's piping soprano, Jake added his own deep bass to the harmony. Their song rose into the star-filled night, carrying across the mountains like a promise that kindness creates family, that love transcends all boundaries, and that sometimes the most extraordinary families are the ones that choose each other. In the Montana wilderness, where legends walked among ordinary folks and giants lived alongside hunters, Jake McCready had finally found what he'd been seeking all along, a place where his heart could rest and grow and love again. The following spring brought changes none of them could have predicted. Word of the Sasquatch Preserve had spread east, attracting scientists, naturalists, and curious visitors from across the country. Jake found himself reluctantly famous as the Sasquatch Whisperer, though he preferred his old title of Bigfoot Hunter. Dr. Margaret Whitfield, a renowned anthropologist from Harvard, arrived with a small team to study both the Sasquatch families and the unique multicultural community that had formed around Jake's homestead. She was a stern woman in her 50s, all sharp angles and skeptical questions, until she witnessed Old Sage teaching little Chenoa to identify medicinal plants by scent alone. "Remarkable," she murmured, frantically scribbling notes as the massive creature gently guided the child's small hands to different leaves and bark samples. The cognitive development, the language adaptation, the social structure, this challenges everything we thought we knew about primate evolution. Jake watched from the porch, Ayana's head resting against his shoulder as she mended one of Chenoa's dresses. The domestic scene felt surreal given the scientific revolution happening in their front yard. "Are you concerned about all this attention?" Dr. Whitfield asked Jake later that evening. "Your privacy, your family's safety?" Jake considered the question seriously. Around the expanded fire pit, an extraordinary gathering was taking place. Kiona was teaching young Sasquatch to braid grass into rope while Winona shared Apache stories with Dr. Whitfield's assistant. The older Sasquatch females had brought their own traditional crafts, creating a cultural exchange unlike anything the world had ever seen. "These creatures have been hiding for centuries," Jake replied finally. "But they chose to reveal themselves to protect something they saw worth protecting. If sharing their existence helps people understand that different doesn't mean dangerous, then maybe it's time." Ayana lifted her head, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "My people know what it means to be misunderstood, to be hunted for being different. If we can help these forest people find acceptance instead of fear, we should." Dr. Whitfield nodded thoughtfully. "I'd like to propose something. What if we established a research station here, with your family as the primary liaisons? It would provide protection through official recognition, funding for the preserve, and ensure that any research is conducted respectfully." The idea sparked intense discussion that lasted deep into the night. The Sasquatch elders conferred in their own language, a series of deep rumbles and melodic tones that seemed to make the very air vibrate. The human members of the extended family shared their concerns and hopes. By dawn, they had reached a consensus. The homestead would become the Sasquatch Cultural Preserve and Research Station, with Jake as the official director and his family as the cultural ambassadors. It was a role none of them had ever imagined, but one that felt right. The summer of 1875 brought delegations from tribes across the Western Territories. Apache, Cheyenne, Lakota, and Crow representatives came to meet the Sasquatch families and learn from their example of peaceful coexistence. Jake found himself hosting peace talks between peoples who had been enemies for generations, all united by their respect for the forest guardians. One evening, as Jake was showing a Lakota elder the traditional Sasquatch method of sustainable hunting, Chenoa ran up to him with news that made his heart race. "Mountain Papa, Mama Ayana says the baby is coming." Jake had known Ayana was pregnant, of course, but they'd been keeping it quiet, uncertain how the various communities would react to a mixed-race child born into such an unusual family. Now, as he rushed to their cabin where Winona and Kiona were assisting with the birth, all those concerns seemed trivial. The labor was long and difficult, even for someone as strong as Ayana. Jake paced the main room, listening to her deep, controlled breathing and the encouraging murmurs of the other women. Old Sage appeared at the window, his massive form somehow comforting rather than threatening. Strong child, the Sasquatch patriarch rumbled softly. When the baby's cry finally echoed through the cabin, Jake felt tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. Dr. Whitfield, who had been helping with the birth, emerged with a tiny bundle wrapped in soft deer hide. "Mr. McCready," she said with a rare smile, "meet your son." Jake took the baby with trembling hands, marveling at the perfect little face that somehow combined his own features with Ayana's proud bone structure. The child's eyes, when they opened, were the same pale blue as his father's but held depths that seemed ancient and wise. "What will you call him?" Kiona asked softly. Jake looked at Ayana, exhausted but radiant in the lamplight. "That's your decision, my love. He's part of your people's future too." Ayana smiled, reaching up to touch their son's tiny hand. "Takoda," she whispered. "It means friend to everyone in my language. He will be a bridge between all our worlds." Little Takoda McCready was welcomed into the most unusual extended family in the American frontier. The Sasquatch young ones brought gifts of specially carved wooden toys. The visiting tribal delegations offered traditional blessings and protective charms. Dr. Whitfield's research team contributed a detailed medical record that would ensure the child's health needs were met with the best knowledge available. But perhaps the most moving moment came when Old Sage approached the cabin with something in his massive hands. It was a cradle, carved from a single piece of ancient oak and decorated with symbols from multiple cultures: Apache, Sasquatch, and even some designs Jake recognized from Sarah's old quilts. "For bridge, child," the great creature said simply. "Strong roots for big journey." As autumn painted the mountains in brilliant colors, Jake reflected on the incredible journey that had brought him to this moment. He stood on the porch of what was now officially known as the Sasquatch Cultural Preserve headquarters, watching his remarkable family. Chenoa, now 10 and growing into a confident young woman, was teaching Takoda simple Apache songs while Ayana worked on beadwork that incorporated traditional patterns from multiple cultures. Kiona and Winona had returned from their homes in town for the harvest celebration, bringing their own families to join the festivities. The research station had published several groundbreaking papers on interspecies communication and sustainable living practices. More importantly, it had become a symbol of hope for peaceful coexistence between different peoples. Marshall Hartwell had been reassigned to a desk job in Washington after his superiors learned about his threats against a federally protected preserve. The cavalry unit that had once hunted Apache refugees now provided security for the research station, their former enemies now their most valuable allies. Dr. Whitfield had established a scholarship fund for Native American students interested in anthropology, funded by the international attention the preserve had attracted. Several young people from various tribes were now studying at Eastern universities, preparing to return as researchers and cultural ambassadors. But for Jake, the greatest transformation was personal. The broken man who had fled to the mountains 25 years earlier no longer existed. In his place stood someone who had learned that healing comes not from isolation but from connection, not from proving points but from building bridges. That evening, as the harvest celebration continued around multiple fire pits, Jake found himself in conversation with Old Sage about the future. "Young ones grow strong," the Sasquatch observed, watching Takoda sleep peacefully in his mother's arms. "Bridge, child. Many changes." "What kind of changes?" Jake asked. Old Sage was quiet for a long moment, his ancient eyes seeming to look far into the distance. "Humans learn slowly, but learn. Different peoples together, stronger than apart." Jake nodded, understanding the weight of responsibility they all carried. They weren't just an unusual family, They were proof that the seemingly impossible could become reality with enough courage and compassion. As the celebration wound down and the various families began to settle for the night, Jake walked the perimeter of the homestead with Ayana, Dakota sleeping against his chest in the hand-carved cradles carrying sling. "Do you ever miss the simple life?" Ayana asked quietly. "Just you and the mountains and your search for the legendary creatures?" Jake chuckled softly. "I found my legendary creatures. They just weren't what I expected." He stopped walking and turned to face her. "You, Kiona, Winona, Chenoa, you're all legendary to me. Stronger than any beast, braver than any warrior, more magical than any monster." Ayana's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of joy. "And you, Jake McCready, turned out to be the greatest hunter of all. You hunted down love itself and refused to let it escape." They stood together in the moonlight, their sleeping son between them, surrounded by the sounds of their extended family settling into peaceful rest. In the distance, the Sasquatch families could be heard singing their nightly songs of gratitude and protection. The Bigfoot hunter had indeed found what he was seeking, though it had taken him decades to understand the true nature of his quest. He had been hunting for belonging, for purpose, for proof that even the most damaged heart could heal and love again. As they walked back toward the cabin, past the research station where tomorrow would bring new discoveries and challenges, Jake reflected on the words he might write if he ever told this story to the world. "Sometimes the greatest hunts are the ones that hunt us back. I thought I was chasing legends through the wilderness, but what I found was that love is the most elusive prey of all, and the only one worth spending a lifetime tracking. In these Montana mountains, where giants walk among ordinary folk and families are built from choices rather than just blood, I learned that home isn't a place you find, it's a place you build with people brave enough to dream of something better." The Wild West had taught him its greatest lesson, that courage isn't about facing down dangerous beasts, it's about opening your heart to dangerous possibilities. And sometimes, if you're very lucky and very brave, those possibilities become the most beautiful reality imaginable. My friends, this tale reminds us that sometimes what we're hunting for isn't what we think we need. Jake thought he was proving the existence of legendary creatures, but what he really needed was proof that his own heart could heal and love again. Sometimes the most powerful love stories happen between people who seem completely different on the surface but share the same depth of heart underneath. If this story touched your heart, remember that kindness, like the water Jake shared, has the power to save lives and build families in the most unexpected ways. The Wild West taught us that home isn't a place, it's the people who choose to stand with you when the dust settles and the sun goes down.